The Lagos rain doesn't just fall. It descends with the weight of 1,000 untold stories, a relentless, percussive drumming against the rusted zinc roofs that form the patchwork quilt of the city's sprawling mainland. It turns the dusty, sun-baked streets into murky, flowing rivers of red earth and discarded dreams. It's a relentless, unforgiving downpour, the kind that washes away everything. But the worries etched deep into the hearts of those who call this chaotic, vibrant, and often cruel city home. Ada knew this rain intimately, with the suffocating familiarity of a prisoner knowing the four walls of their cell. It wasn't just weather to her. It was a metaphor, a cold, impartial force that washed away dreams and left behind only the mud of reality. It was the soundtrack to her survival. You probably think you know hardship, but you haven't known the quiet, gnawing desperation of choosing between a textbook that holds your future and a meal that will get you through the night. You wouldn't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. It's a small way for us to connect across the miles, sharing stories in the digital glow. Now, let's return to Ada, and the rain that was about to change the entire course of her life, 18 years old, yet her eyes held the ancient weariness of someone who had carried the world on shoulders far too slender for the load. Ada stood huddled under the flimsy, dripping awning of a second-hand bookstore in Yaba, the air thick with the competing smells of wet earth, old paper, and the faint, greasy aroma of suya from a nearby stall. It was a scent she usually found comforting, a reminder of the knowledge and stories packed into the leaning towers of books inside. But not tonight. Tonight, every fat drop of rain that splattered onto the pavement felt like a ticking clock, counting down the precious minutes to another confrontation she couldn't afford to lose. She clutched a worn-out chemistry textbook to her chest as if it were a shield. Its pages were slightly warped from previous, less successful encounters with the Lagos rain, its spine held together by a stubborn layer of tape. This book was her everything, her shield against the ignorance around her, her sword in the silent battle for a better life, her only ticket out of the suffocating circumstances she had been born into. An orphan since a brutal fever had claimed both her parents at the age of 10, Ada had learned to navigate the world with a quiet, steely resilience that few ever saw or acknowledged. She lived in a crowded, face me, I face you compound, a chaotic maze of shared corridors and overlapping lives, renting a small, windowless room that was more of a closet than a living space. Her landlady, Mrs. Gallo, was a woman whose kindness was as scarce as the naira in Ada's worn-out purse. Her phone, an old second-hand model with a spiderweb of cracks across the screen, vibrated weakly in her pocket. She knew who it was without looking. A deep sigh escaped her lips before she answered, holding the phone close to her ear to block out the insistent drumming of the rain. "Adeze, where are you?" The voice on the other end was shrill, sharp, and laced with the acidic impatience of a woman who felt the world owed her something. It was Mrs. Gallo. "Good evening. Ma, I'm on my way. The rain is just very heavy tonight," Ada said, her voice a model of polite composure, betraying none of the raw panic churning in her stomach. "I don't care if a flood is carrying you and your useless books away." "My rent money. You promised me you would have it today. This is the third time you are telling me this same old story, Ma. I will have it, I promise you. The family I tutor for, their father was ill, so they couldn't pay me today. They said first thing in the morning, I just need one more night. Please, one more night." "Mrs. Gallo screeched, her voice rising to a pitch that made Ada flinch. Do I look like a charity organization? Do you see a sign on my head that says free lodging for hopeless orphans if that money is not on my table by the time I wake up? You and your precious, useless books can find a new place to live, under a bridge. Perhaps that is where people like you belong. The line went dead with a sharp, final click. Ada squeezed her eyes shut, a familiar burning sensation behind them. She would not cry. Not here. Not now. Crying was a luxury, an indulgence she had learned to suppress. She had already spent her quota for the month, crying silently into her pillow the night she realized she didn't have enough money for both her JAMB registration and a new pair of school shoes. The books had won. They always had to. She took a deep, shaky breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs, and looked up. Her gaze was drawn, as it always was, across the rain-swept, chaotic street to the one place that represented everything she was fighting for. The University of Lagos. Its grand gates and towering faculty buildings were just faint, hazy silhouettes in the downpour, shimmering like a mirage. But to Ada, it was a beacon, a promised land, a world of lecture halls, libraries, and possibilities. A world where what was in your head mattered more than what was in your pocket. She had aced her JAM exams, scoring in the high 290s, a result that had made her tutorial teacher weep with pride. She had poured every spare moment, every ounce of her being, into studying, memorizing formulas by candlelight, trading her meager lunch for extra lessons, reading until the words blurred and danced before her tired eyes. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she was smart enough. She just wasn't rich enough. Her application for a scholarship, her only fragile hope, was still pending, and every day of waiting felt like a lifetime. She pulled her thin, second-hand cardigan tighter around her shivering frame. The wind had picked up, a mischievous accomplice to the rain, whipping the downpour sideways and rendering the small protection of the awning almost useless. She had to go. She had to face Mrs. Gallows' wrath, to beg and plead for one more night of grace she knew she wouldn't receive. She took a hesitant step out from under the awning, bracing herself to make a desperate run for it, when a sudden, violent screech of tires and a loud splash of muddy water made her jump back. A sleek, black Mercedes, a car that looked like it had been carved from the night itself, had pulled over abruptly just a few feet away. Its powerful engine sputtered, coughed, and then died with a pathetic whimper. The hazard lights began to blink in a frantic, rhythmic pulse, their orange glow cutting through the gray curtain of rain. This wasn't just a car. It was a declaration of wealth, a symbol of a world so far removed from hers. It might as well have been on another planet. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, immediately getting pummeled by the rain. He was older, perhaps in his early 60s, dressed in a classic, tailored suit that was now being mercilessly assaulted by the downpour. He muttered something in frustration, a word lost to the storm, as he ran a hand through his distinguished, silver-streaked hair. He fumbled to open a large, black umbrella, but a sudden gust of wind caught it, turning it inside out with a sickening snap. With a sound of pure exasperation, he gave up and ran. A man stripped of his usual armor of wealth and control, towards the same small, inadequate awning where Ada stood, a silent witness to his sudden misfortune. He was now just another soul caught in the rain. The man leaned his tall frame against the bookstore's graffiti-scarred wall, letting out a frustrated sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a world Ada could only begin to imagine. His name, though she had no way of knowing it at that moment, was Professor Alabi, the highly respected and somewhat feared dean of the Faculty of Sciences at the very university that held her dreams captive. Just an hour ago, he had been standing at a podium, delivering a keynote address on the philosophical implications of quantum physics to a rapt audience of academics and dignitaries. He had spoken of parallel universes and the infinite possibilities of existence. Now, he was just a man with a dead car, a dying phone, a broken umbrella, and a suit that was beginning to feel like a cold, wet sponge of despair. He finally seemed to register her presence, a small, still figure half hidden in the shadows of the awning. His eyes, sharp and perceptive even behind rain-spotted glasses, met hers for a brief moment. He offered a polite, weary nod, a small acknowledgement of their shared, temporary prison. "Quite a storm," he said, his voice a low, educated rumble that sounded as out of place against the backdrop of the noisy, chaotic street as his expensive leather shoes. "Yes, sir, it is," Ada replied softly, her voice barely a whisper. She could see the fine lines of stress etched around his eyes, the subtle, frustrated tremor in his hands as he tried in vain to wipe the rain from his wire-rimmed glasses with a hopelessly damp handkerchief. He wasn't just annoyed by the inconvenience, he was genuinely distressed, a man clearly unaccustomed to being at the mercy of circumstance. A flicker of something, a painful, half-forgotten memory of her own father looking just as lost and overwhelmed after a long, soul-crushing day of fruitless job-searching, stirred deep in her chest. It was a feeling she recognized the quiet panic of a good man losing control. Professor Alabi pulled out his sleek smartphone, his thumb swiping uselessly at the dark, unresponsive screen before he sighed in defeat. "Completely dead," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He looked out at the relentless, impenetrable curtain of rain, then back at his stalled, silent car, a perfect, expensive statue of impotence. The driver he had so confidently sent home early, certain he could manage the short drive himself, was likely already on the other side of the city, oblivious. He needed to get home. His wife, Maria, who had been frail of late, was expecting him. She worried terribly if he was even a few minutes late these days. He needed to call a tow truck, a taxi, anyone. But he was stranded, an island of privilege suddenly cut off from his well-ordered world. He looked up and down the street, a desperate, almost wild edge creeping into his scholarly composure. "I don't suppose," he began, turning to Ada, his voice stripped of its usual authority, now holding a note of hesitant appeal. "You have a phone I could borrow for just a moment?" He asked, not with the entitlement she often saw in the wealthy men who sometimes visited her compound, but with the quiet, humbling desperation of a man who had completely and utterly run out of options. "I do, sir," Ada said, her hand going instinctively to her pocket and pulling out her own cracked, humble phone. "But I'm afraid I have no airtime. I was going to buy a recharge card on my way home." The words felt like a quiet confession of her poverty, a stark admission of the meager reality of her existence. But she said them without a trace of shame. It was simply her truth. Of course. My apologies," he said, the last flicker of hope draining from his face. He looked out at the rain again, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll have to walk then. The main road is a few blocks from here. I should be able to find a taxi there." He squared his shoulders, a man trying to reclaim some semblance of control, gathering himself to plunge back into the heart of the storm. But the thought of this distinguished, elderly man, this stranger who looked so much like a respected professor, like someone's grandfather, walking alone in this violent downpour, struck Ada as fundamentally, unequivocally wrong. It was a dissonant note in the chaotic symphony of the evening, a problem she felt an inexplicable, urgent need to solve, even as her own problems threatened to drown her. She looked at him, then down at the worn textbook clutched protectively in her hands. It was more than paper and ink. It was her passport out of this life, its pages a precious, fragile map to her future. Then she looked at the small, battered umbrella tucked into the side pocket of her school bag. It was her only defense against the storm, a small, inadequate shield against a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. The moment Professor Alabi took that determined step towards the edge of the awning, his body tensing to re-enter the deluge, Ada's mind, usually so disciplined and focused on academic formulas, exploded into a rapid, heart-wrenching calculation of risk versus compassion. She saw a vivid, painful sequence of events unfold in her imagination with the clarity of a premonition. She saw him, a man of letters and quiet dignity, drenched and shivering, trying to flag down a taxi on the main road, only to be ignored by a succession of drivers unwilling to stop in the torrential rain. She saw the city's notorious area boys noticing his expensive, waterlogged suit, marking him as a vulnerable target. She saw him falling ill, the cold seeping deep into his bones. And then, her heart clenched with a pain that was sharp and immediate. She saw her textbook, her passport, her everything, its precious pages, a testament to countless nights fueled by cheap candles and fierce determination, filled with notes she had painstakingly scribbled in the margins, summaries she had recited to herself until the complex chemical formulas became a second language. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that if it got soaked, the cheap ink of her pen would bleed, the fragile pages would tear, and months of hard, relentless work would be reduced to a pulpy, illegible mess. This book was her entire fortune, the only real weapon she possessed in her fierce, silent war against a life of poverty. She hugged it tighter to her chest, a primal, protective instinct taking over. Her entire being, conditioned by years of scarcity and the constant need to guard what little she had, screamed a single, desperate word: "Don't." But then she looked at the man again. He had the same quiet dignity her own father had possessed, the same gentle weariness in his eyes that spoke of a life of responsibility. She remembered her father, soaked to the bone after walking miles home in a similar storm because he had given his last transport fare to a stranded, pregnant neighbor who was in distress. Kindness, adayeze, he had told her that night, his teeth chattering as her mother wrapped him in the only dry cloth they owned, is the only currency that makes us all rich. It is a debt we owe to each other, a light we must pass on. The memory was not just a thought. It was a physical sensation, a sudden warmth that spread through her chest, a powerful, loving fire that overpowered the encroaching chill of the rain. In that split second, the internal battle was over. Her father's legacy won. The choice was made. With a swift, decisive movement that surprised even herself, she shrugged off her thin, faded cardigan. It was threadbare and offered little more than a suggestion of warmth. But it was dry. She carefully, almost reverently, wrapped the chemistry textbook inside the fabric, creating a makeshift, waterproof shield for her dream. She tucked the precious bundle securely back into her school bag, zipping it up tightly, her fingers moving with a sense of purpose. Then she pulled out her small, battered umbrella. One of its metal ribs was slightly bent, a casualty of a previous storm, making it lean a little to one side like a tired, old soldier who refused to fall. But it was still functional. It was her only shield. "Sir, wait," she called out, her voice clear and firm, a small, strong sound that managed to rise above the relentless drumming of the rain. Professor Alabi turned, his hand still on his briefcase, his expression one of polite confusion. She stepped forward and held out the umbrella to him. "Please, take this. You need it more than I do." He stared at the umbrella, then at her, utterly baffled and visibly moved by the gesture. But, what about you and your books? You'll be soaked to the skin. I'm used to the rain, she said with a small, genuine smile that seemed to momentarily push back the gloom of the evening. It was a lie. Of course, no one ever truly gets used to being cold and miserable. And my book is safe now. She patted her bag for reassurance. Your health, sir, is more important. You could catch a terrible cold walking in this weather. She didn't wait for him to argue, to protest, to offer payment he didn't have on him. She pushed the umbrella's worn plastic handle firmly into his hand, her small, cool fingers brushing against his for a brief, electric moment. A final, silent offering. Go on, she urged gently, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Find a taxi. Get home safe to your family. Before he could properly thank her, before he could even think to ask for her name, she did something that left him absolutely speechless. She pulled her now unprotected school bag over her head, using its thin canvas as a flimsy, hopeless shield against the elements. Then, she ran. She darted out from under the awning into the torrential downpour. She ran with a purpose, her small, determined form quickly becoming a silhouette against the gray, rainy street, leaving him standing there, holding her crooked, humble umbrella, a testament to an act of kindness so pure, so unexpected. It felt like a beacon of light in the gathering storm. As she ran, she never noticed the gentle thud of her precious textbook, now loosed from her unzipped bag, falling onto the wet, glistening pavement behind her. Professor Alabi stood frozen under the small, crooked umbrella, a shield he hadn't asked for but now held like a sacred, baffling artifact. He watched, mesmerized, as Ada's small figure was swallowed by the gray, swirling mist of the rain. She wasn't just running. She was a force of nature in her own right. A small, resilient warrior armed with nothing but a school bag against a hostile world. He was, for the first time in many years, completely and utterly stunned into silence. In his world, the rarefied atmosphere of academia and corporate sponsorships, kindness was a currency, a carefully calculated move in a complex, lifelong game of social and professional chess. It was networking. It was favor trading. It was a long-term investment in future returns. People gave with the unspoken expectation of receiving something of equal or greater value later. But this was different. This was raw, unconditional empathy, flowing from a source he thought had long run dry in the heart of Lagos. It was a gift with no strings attached, from a girl who clearly had nothing to give but her own comfort, and had given it freely, without a moment's hesitation. He was about to finally turn and follow her advice, to find that elusive taxi and retreat to the warmth of his home, when his eyes caught something on the pavement where she had been standing, a dark rectangle, half submerged in a quickly forming puddle. It was the textbook. In her haste, it must have slipped from her unzipped bag. He bent down and picked it up, his heart sinking. The cover, already soaked, read Advanced Principles of Organic Chemistry, a formidable and surprising choice for a girl who looked to be barely out of secondary school. He opened it carefully, a strange sense of trespass warring with his insatiable academic curiosity. And what he saw inside made him pause, the rain and the cold and his own troubles completely forgotten. The pages weren't just filled with printed text. They were alive, a vibrant, breathing testament to a mind fiercely at work. In the margins, in a neat, precise, and almost beautiful hand, were annotations, questions, and observations so insightful, so probing, they could have come from one of his top final-year university students. She wasn't just reading or memorizing. She was engaging in a silent, intense debate with the author, challenging the established concepts, digging for a deeper, more fundamental understanding. On one page, annotated with diagrams of complex molecular structures, she had even corrected a minor but significant error in one of the formulas, an error that had slipped past generations of editors and professors. It was something only a truly gifted and obsessively meticulous mind would ever notice. He flipped through the pages, a sense of professional awe, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, growing within him. This was the work of a brilliant, hungry mind, a mind that deserved to be nurtured in the finest lecture halls, not left to fight the storms alone under a leaking bookstore awning. Then, on the inside cover, written in the same neat, determined script, he saw her name. Aisée. And underneath it, a small, penciled-in quote, a personal mantra that seemed to sum up her entire existence. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. He felt a pang of something deep and resonant, a powerful connection that transcended the moment. He, too, had been a boy from a poor, rural village, with nothing but a fiercely sharp mind and a stack of borrowed, second-hand books as his only inheritance. He knew this hunger. He recognized this fight. Just as he was about to close the book, his driver, having finally coaxed the Mercedes' stubborn engine back to life, pulled up beside him with a splash. "Professor, I'm so sorry. The engine just, The driver's words trailed off as he saw the dean standing under a small, rickety children's umbrella, holding a drenched textbook as if it were a priceless manuscript. Professor Alabi didn't seem to hear him. He was still staring at the book, his thumb brushing against the final, slightly damp page. That's when he found it, scribbled at the very bottom. In a moment of either profound desperation or pure, unshakable defiance, was a line that hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a note to herself, a whisper on paper meant for no one else in the world to see. It read, "Don't give up. Ada. Papa would be so proud." That was the moment that changed everything. He was no longer just an impressed educator. He was a witness to a silent, heroic struggle. He saw a reflection of his own past, of his own parents who had sacrificed everything, selling their small plot of land so that he could have a chance at a different life. In that instant, Professor Alabi made a decision, a quiet, solemn vow to the universe and to the memory of his own father. This wasn't just about returning a lost book anymore. This was about making sure a brilliant mind, a kind and resilient soul like Aisée, didn't get washed away by the relentless storm of life. He got into the warmth of his car, the precious, damp book placed carefully on the empty leather seat beside him, like an honored guest. "Take me to the university," he told his bewildered driver, his voice imbued with a new, urgent sense of purpose. "I have something I need to check, urgently." While Professor Alabi, propelled by a newfound sense of mission, was speeding towards the university to unravel a destiny. Ada was facing a storm of a different, more intimate kind. She finally arrived back at the Face Me, I Face You compound, her uniform soaked through and clinging to her skin like a second. Colder skin. Her hair, which she had carefully braided that morning, now dripped cold, grimy water down her back. The compound was a cacophony of smells and sounds, the sharp, enticing aroma of frying onions from one room, the loud, argumentative blare of a football commentary from another, the wail of a teething baby. Usually, this chaotic blend was the familiar, if not entirely comforting, white noise of her life, but tonight it only served to amplify the profound chill that had settled deep in her bones, a chill that had little to do with the rain. Mrs. Gallo was waiting for her. She wasn't just waiting. She was positioned in the doorway of Ada's small room like a sentinel of doom, a formidable, unmoving obstacle. Her arms were crossed over her ample chest, and a thunderous, unforgiving expression was etched onto her face. "So, you have finally decided to show your face," she began, her voice dripping with a carefully cultivated scorn that was sharper than the evening chill. "I was beginning to think you had run away. Or perhaps the flood, in its infinite mercy, decide to carry you away to a better place. Good evening, Emma. I'm so sorry I'm late," Ada said, her teeth chattering slightly as she tried to squeeze past her into the relative sanctuary of her small room. Mrs. Gallo shifted her weight, effectively blocking the entrance. "Sorry will not pay my rent. Adese. Sorry will not put food on my table or kerosene in my stove. Where is my money?" "Ma, I told you on the phone. My tutoring payment is coming tomorrow. The family I work for. Their father was ill, so they couldn't pay me today. They promised me first thing in the morning. I will have it then. I will bring it straight to you. I swear. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. It is always tomorrow." Mrs. Gallo's voice rose, deliberately, to a shrill crescendo, a performance for the benefit of their neighbors. And right on cue, other tenants began to peek from their doorways, their faces a predictable mixture of mild pity and morbid curiosity. "I am tired of your endless stories. Do you think because you are an orphan, a poor, parentless girl, that I should pity you? This is Lagos. Pity does not buy kerosene. Just as the public humiliation was reaching its intended peak, a flashy car, a cherry-red convertible with spinning rims that seemed to scream, 'Look at me,' pulled up in front of the compound. Its bass-heavy Afrobeats music vibrated through the very ground, a confident, arrogant heartbeat. The driver's side door swung open, and Chidi stepped out. He was the son of a wealthy businessman, a boy from Ada's jam tutorial class who seemed to derive a special pleasure from reminding everyone, especially Ada, of his superior status. He sauntered over, a cruel, amused smirk playing on his handsome face, clearly relishing the spectacle of her degradation. Well, what have we here?" Chidi said, his voice loud enough for the entire compound to hear, as he looked from a drenched and shivering Ada to the furious landlady. "Trouble in paradise, Ada. Having some cash flow issues, Mrs. Gallo, seeing a potential ally in wealth and status, immediately turned her tirade towards him, her tone shifting seamlessly to one of sycophantic complaint. "Ah, Chidi, my son, you see this girl, she is owing me rent for 2 months, and instead of finding honest work to pay her debts, she is busy walking in the rain like a common mad person," Chidi chuckled, leaning casually against the gleaming hood of his expensive car. "I'm not surprised. I saw her earlier on the main road, looking like a drowned rat. I told you." "Ada," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Stop confusing ambition with entitlement. The university is an inheritance for people like me, not a lottery ticket for people like you, Hen. Your place isn't in a lecture hall. It's here, where you belong. Know your lane." The words, spoken so casually, so cruelly, in front of her neighbors and the world, were like a physical slap. Ada felt her face burn with a shame so intense it was dizzying. She didn't retaliate. She didn't cry. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply stood there, absorbing the verbal blows, her silence a stark, dignified contrast to their loud, ugly words. She lowered her head, the very picture of defeat, which only seemed to fuel their contempt for her. Mrs. Gallo, emboldened by Chidi's presence and the silent, watching audience, gave a final, triumphant shove, not with her hands, but with her harsh, final words. "Pack your miserable things, I want you out by morning, I am done with you," she yelled, before turning and stomping back to her own room, slamming the door with a sense of absolute finality. Chidi laughed one last time, a short barking sound of amusement, got back into his car, revved the engine unnecessarily, and sped away, splashing a wave of muddy water onto the onlookers. He left Ada standing alone in the center of the courtyard, the cruel laughter of her neighbors echoing in the damp, heavy air. This was it. This was her rock bottom, a lonely, desolate place where dreams came to die. The next morning, while Ada was quietly contemplating a future that seemed to have shrunk to the size of a packed suitcase, Professor Alabi sat in his spacious, sun-lit office at the university. The quiet, reassuring hum of the air conditioner was a world away from the chaotic, rain-lashed desperation of the previous night. Ada's worn chemistry textbook, now carefully dried and pressed overnight, lay open on his polished mahogany desk. He had spent the better part of the morning lost in its pages, not just rereading her brilliant, insightful notes, but feeling the fierce, untamed intelligence and the desperate, aching hope that emanated from them. This was more than a book. It was a testament to a spirit that simply refused to be extinguished by circumstance. With a new sense of urgency, he buzzed his secretary, his voice calm but imbued with an unmistakable authority. "Cynthia, could you please get me the full admissions file for a candidate named Adayeze Eze? I want everything." Minutes later, the file was in his hands. He opened it, and his brow furrowed almost immediately. Everything on the surface appeared to be in impeccable order, her spectacular JAM scores, which placed her not just in the top tier of applicants, but in the top 1% of all applicants nationwide. A collection of glowing letters of recommendation from her community school teachers, who used words like once-in-a-generation student and a mind of profound curiosity, and her powerfully written personal essay about her dream of using science to find affordable clean water solutions for rural communities, a dream both ambitious and deeply altruistic. On paper, she was the absolute, unequivocal perfect candidate for the prestigious Chancellor's Scholarship. Yet, on the final page of the summary report, a bold red stamp, applied with what seemed like unnecessary and almost violent force, declared her application denied. The reason cited was a vague and flimsy, incomplete documentation, financial aid verification pending. It made absolutely no sense. For an orphan applicant with no financial history to verify, this step was usually a swift, compassionate formality, a simple box to be ticked by a junior administrator. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. His instincts, honed by decades of navigating the subtle and often treacherous currents of academic politics, screamed that this was not a clerical error. This was sabotage. "Cynthia," he called over the intercom again, his voice now devoid of its usual warmth, replaced by a cold, hard edge. "I need the full digital submission logs for this application. I want to see every timestamp, every access point, every administrative override. I want the entire digital footprint." The digital trail, when it appeared on his screen, revealed the first crack in the official story. Ada's file had been accessed an unusual number of times after the official submission deadline. These accesses were not from the main admissions committee's secure server, but from a single, isolated terminal in the junior admissions office, a terminal assigned to a mid-level administrator named Mr. Johnson. The final damning denied status had been entered at 10:47 p.m. 2 nights ago, long after the building was officially closed and locked. "Get me Mr. Johnson from admissions," the professor said, his voice now as cold and hard as steel. "Tell him I want to see him in my office. Now." Mr. Johnson, a nervous, perpetually sweating man with shifty eyes and a tie that was just a little too tight, stammered through a pathetic, pre-rehearsed explanation. He blamed the discrepancy on a rare system glitch, a server overload from too many last-minute applications, a story so full of holes it wouldn't hold water in a sieve. But Professor Alabi wasn't buying it. He had seen this kind of administrative error before. It often had a name, a motive, and a very specific price. "Mr. Johnson," the professor said calmly, leaning forward across his vast desk, his fingers steepled, creating an intimidating pyramid of authority. "This university's reputation, a reputation that has taken over 50 years to build, rests on a single, sacred foundation: meritocracy. It is a foundation I will not see compromised by convenient glitches. I will ask you one more time, and I strongly advise you to consider the full and lifelong consequences of your answer. Who instructed you to flag this file?" Under the crushing weight of the dean's unwavering, analytical gaze, the man's flimsy composure crumbled. The truth came tumbling out in a torrent of whispered, terrified confessions. The instruction, he admitted, had come with the unspoken promise of a hefty donation to his personal charity foundation from a prominent, long-standing benefactor of the university, a man named Chief Adebayo, Chidi's father. The chief had been concerned that his own son's less-than-stellar application might not secure him a coveted spot in the fiercely competitive science program. He had therefore taken proactive steps to eliminate the top competition, and at the very top of that list, by a very wide and intimidating margin, was the name Adaeze Eze. The sheer, naked injustice of it all was breathtaking in its arrogance and cruelty. A brilliant girl's future, a future she had fought and bled and sacrificed for, had been casually and callously tossed aside to make way for the mediocre, entitled son of a rich man. The quiet, simmering fury that had been building in Professor Alabi all morning was now ready to boil over into a righteous, cleansing fire. Professor Alabi's anger was a quiet, controlled storm, far more terrifying than any loud, theatrical outburst. It was the cold, focused fury of an intellectual whose most sacred principles had been violated. He picked up his phone and made 2 calls, his movements precise and deliberate, like a surgeon preparing for a delicate but necessary operation. The first was to the university's legal counsel, instructing them to prepare for an immediate and thorough investigation into admissions fraud, with the full weight of his office behind it. The second was to Chief Adebayo himself. "Mr. Adebayo," he said, his voice dangerously calm and chillingly polite. "This is Dean Alabi from the University of Lagos. I believe we have an urgent matter to discuss regarding your son's admission and a very generous, albeit misplaced, donation. My office. 1 hour. I suggest you do not be late." An hour later, The dean's expansive office was thick with attention that felt almost physical. Chidi and his father sat in the plush guest chairs, their usual swagger and effortless arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by a nervous, palpable apprehension. They looked like schoolboys summoned to the headmaster's office. The guilty admissions officer, Mr. Johnson, stood near the door, his face pale, looking as if he was about to faint. Professor Alabi began without preamble, laying out the evidence on his desk like a prosecutor presenting an airtight case, the digital logs, the time-stamped access records from a private terminal, the now signed and notarized confession from a weeping Mr. Johnson. Chief Adebayo, a man accustomed to bullying and bribing his way through life, tried to bluster his way through it, his voice booming with a false, hollow indignation. Now, see here, Dean, this is clearly a terrible misunderstanding. My family has always been a great supporter of this fine institution. Your support is, of course, appreciated, Mr. Adebayo. The professor cut in smoothly, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, which only made it more menacing. But it does not grant you the right to sabotage the future of a more deserving student. It does not give you the right to cheat the system and corrupt my staff. More deserving, Chidi scoffed, a flicker of his old, entitled arrogance returning. A foolish mistake. That street girl from the Face Me I Face You compound. That street girl? Professor Alabi said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper that made everyone in the room, including the chief, flinch. Has more intellectual curiosity and raw, untamed talent in her little finger than you have displayed in your entire privileged, pampered life. He paused, letting the insult land with the surgical precision of a master duelist. Then, he picked up Ada's worn chemistry textbook from his desk, holding it as if it were a sacred text. But her undeniable academic merit is not what I wish to discuss right now. I want to tell you about the kind of person, the kind of character, you conspired to crush. He then recounted, with quiet, compelling eloquence, the story of the previous night, the raging storm, his stalled car, his own moment of vulnerability. He described the young, drenched girl who, despite her own obvious poverty and distress, had given him her only umbrella, choosing to protect a complete stranger's health over her own comfort. He detailed how she had sacrificed the safety of her most precious, irreplaceable possession, her textbook, just to perform an act of selfless kindness. As he spoke, a profound silence fell over the room. Chief Adebayo's face went through a rapid transformation from indignant to red to a pale, ashen gray of utter shame. Chidi just stared at the expensive Persian carpet, looking as if he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. That, Professor Alabi concluded, his piercing gaze locking with Chief Adebayo's, is the character of the student you tried to discard. A character, I might add, that is the very embodiment of the principles of integrity, humanity, and excellence this university was founded upon. Just then, as if on cue, a soft knock came at the door. "Come in," the professor called, his voice returning to its normal volume. The door opened, and Ada stepped inside. His secretary had summoned her, telling her only that the dean needed to see her regarding her application. She looked small, impossibly nervous, and utterly bewildered to find Chidi and his powerful father sitting there in disgrace. "Adaeze," Professor Alabi said gently, his voice softening with a fatherly warmth. "Please, come here." Chief Adebayo, a man used to commanding boardrooms and intimidating politicians, could not bring himself to meet her eyes. His son looked like he had shrunk in his designer chair. Ada stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been packing her few belongings all morning, her eviction notice a cold, hard fact. She didn't know why she was here, but she faced them all with the same quiet dignity with which she faced everything else in her life. "Yes, sir." The professor gestured for her to stand beside his desk. "These gentlemen," he said, a slight, sharp edge returning to his voice, "have something they need to witness." He then turned to Ada. "Adaez, I have reviewed your file. It seems you have been treated most unjustly by our admissions process." He then looked straight at Chidi's father, his eyes like flint. "Well, Mr. Adebayo, I believe you have something to say." But before the man could stammer out a pre-packaged, lawyer-approved apology, Professor Alabi had another, better idea. "Actually," he said, "perhaps we should hear from the student herself." He gestured for Ada to come closer. "Adaeze, these men seem to believe that a university education is a commodity, something that can be bought, sold, and manipulated. What do you have to say about that?" Ada looked from the powerful, ashamed father to the humiliated, arrogant son, and then back to the dean. She took a deep breath, and the words came out, not from a place of anger, but from a place of profound, unshakable truth. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a conviction that filled the entire room. "Your son's tuition is paid with money. Mine is paid with sleepless nights and a worn-out textbook. Some things, they simply cannot be bought." Ada's words, simple, direct, and devastatingly true, hung in the silent, tension-filled office like a final, unassailable judgment. The quiet, unshakable dignity with which she spoke was a more powerful indictment of their corruption than any legal argument or angry tirade could ever be. Chidi's father, Chief Adebayo, a man who had built a formidable empire on aggressive negotiations and the sheer force of his will and wallet, had no response. For the first time in his adult life, he was rendered completely speechless. He simply sat there, a powerful man made small and insignificant by a young girl's simple, profound integrity. He finally looked at his son, not with the usual indulgent pride, but with a deep, weary disappointment, as if seeing the true, hollow nature of the boy he had raised for the very first time. Professor Alabi gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had seen enough. The lesson had been delivered. He gestured curtly for the Adebayos and a visibly trembling Mr. Johnson to leave his office. After they had shuffled out in a cloud of shared disgrace, he turned to a still bewildered Ada, who looked as if she were waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Please, Adaeze, sit down." She sat on the edge of the plush leather chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Her mind was still trying to process the surreal, high-stakes drama she had just unwittingly walked into. The professor let the silence in the room settle for a moment, allowing the tension to dissipate, before he slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished expanse of his mahogany desk towards her. "This," he said, his voice warm and resonant, "is your official acceptance letter to the University of Lagos." Ada's breath caught in her throat with a small, audible gasp. She reached for it with trembling fingers, her eyes wide with a hope she hadn't dared to feel just moments before. "But the fees, the scholarship, I was told." "Open it," he urged gently, a soft smile playing on his lips. She broke the seal with fumbling, clumsy fingers and pulled out the documents inside. The first page was the letter of acceptance, the university's elegant crest gleaming at the top. It was real. It was happening. But it was the second document that made her cusp, a sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. It was an official letter, signed by the university chancellor himself, confirming that she, Adeze Eze, had been awarded the prestigious Chancellor's Merit Scholarship, a full ride, covering not just tuition, but accommodation in the university hostels, a generous book allowance, and a living stipend for all 4 years of her undergraduate study. It was the most coveted, most competitive scholarship the university offered, a prize reserved for the truly exceptional, a dream she had never, ever allowed herself to seriously entertain. I don't understand," she whispered, the words barely audible as hot, sudden tears finally blurred her vision, obscuring the beautiful, impossible words on the page. "My application. It was denied." "It was wrongfully denied," Professor Alabi corrected, his voice firm with conviction. "And the scholarship committee, upon reviewing your complete file and certain new, compelling information that has come to light, has moved swiftly and unanimously to rectify that grave error." He leaned forward, his expression a mixture of professorial gravity and a genuine, almost fatherly warmth that she had not seen before. "Ada, the day you gave me your umbrella, you didn't just shield an old man from the rain. You reminded me, and indeed you reminded this entire university, of what our true purpose is. It is not to cater to the wealthy and the powerful. It is to find and nurture brilliant, compassionate, and resilient minds, regardless of their circumstances, minds and hearts, like yours." He then gently slid her worn chemistry textbook across the desk. It was dry now, the pages still slightly crinkled, a permanent scar from its battle with the storm, but it felt solid and real in her hands. "And I believe this belongs to you." Ada took the book, her hope, her future, and hugged it tightly to her chest as the tears she had held back for so long through the hunger. The insults, the eviction notice, the public humiliation finally flowed freely. They were not tears of sadness or despair, but tears of overwhelming, unbelievable, cleansing joy. "Thank you, sir," she sobbed, unable to say more. "Thank you for believing in me." "No, Adeze," Professor Alabi said, his own eyes misty as he stood and walked around the desk to place a gentle, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you. You have reminded an old, tired professor what truly matters." An hour later, as Ada walked out of the dean's office and into the sunlit, vibrant quad of the university campus, she was no longer just a visitor looking in from the rainy streets outside. She belonged here. She looked up at the towering jacaranda trees, their magnificent purple blossoms forming a royal, welcoming canopy above her. The journey had been long, the rain had been relentless, but she had finally made it. She had walked through her own personal storm, armed with little more than a textbook and an unshakable belief in her father's wisdom. And on the other side, she had found not just her dream, but the profound, unshakable truth of her own worth. The Lagos rain doesn't just fall. It descends with the weight of 1,000 untold stories, a relentless, percussive drumming against the rusted zinc roofs that form the patchwork quilt of the city's sprawling mainland. It turns the dusty, sun-baked streets into murky, flowing rivers of red earth and discarded dreams. It's a relentless, unforgiving downpour, the kind that washes away everything. But the worries etched deep into the hearts of those who call this chaotic, vibrant, and often cruel city home. Ada knew this rain intimately, with the suffocating familiarity of a prisoner knowing the four walls of their cell. It wasn't just weather to her. It was a metaphor, a cold, impartial force that washed away dreams and left behind only the mud of reality. It was the soundtrack to her survival. You probably think you know hardship, but you haven't known the quiet, gnawing desperation of choosing between a textbook that holds your future and a meal that will get you through the night. You wouldn't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. It's a small way for us to connect across the miles, sharing stories in the digital glow. Now, let's return to Ada, and the rain that was about to change the entire course of her life, 18 years old, yet her eyes held the ancient weariness of someone who had carried the world on shoulders far too slender for the load. Ada stood huddled under the flimsy, dripping awning of a second-hand bookstore in Yaba, the air thick with the competing smells of wet earth, old paper, and the faint, greasy aroma of suya from a nearby stall. It was a scent she usually found comforting, a reminder of the knowledge and stories packed into the leaning towers of books inside. But not tonight. Tonight, every fat drop of rain that splattered onto the pavement felt like a ticking clock, counting down the precious minutes to another confrontation she couldn't afford to lose. She clutched a worn-out chemistry textbook to her chest as if it were a shield. Its pages were slightly warped from previous, less successful encounters with the Lagos rain, its spine held together by a stubborn layer of tape. This book was her everything, her shield against the ignorance around her, her sword in the silent battle for a better life, her only ticket out of the suffocating circumstances she had been born into. An orphan since a brutal fever had claimed both her parents at the age of 10. Ada had learned to navigate the world with a quiet, steely resilience that few ever saw or acknowledged. She lived in a crowded, face me, I face you compound, a chaotic maze of shared corridors and overlapping lives, renting a small, windowless room that was more of a closet than a living space. Her landlady, Mrs. Gallo, was a woman whose kindness was as scarce as the naira in Ada's worn-out purse. Her phone, an old second-hand model with a spiderweb of cracks across the screen, vibrated weakly in her pocket. She knew who it was without looking. A deep sigh escaped her lips before she answered, holding the phone close to her ear to block out the insistent drumming of the rain. "Adeze, where are you?" The voice on the other end was shrill, sharp, and laced with the acidic impatience of a woman who felt the world owed her something. It was Mrs. Gallo. "Good evening. Ma, I'm on my way. The rain is just very heavy tonight," Ada said, her voice a model of polite composure, betraying none of the raw panic churning in her stomach. "I don't care if a flood is carrying you and your useless books away." "My rent money. You promised me you would have it today. This is the third time you are telling me this same old story, Ma. I will have it, I promise you. The family I tutor for, their father was ill, so they couldn't pay me today. They said first thing in the morning, I just need one more night. Please, one more night." "Mrs. Gallo screeched, her voice rising to a pitch that made Ada flinch. "Do I look like a charity organization? Do you see a sign on my head that says free lodging for hopeless orphans if that money is not on my table by the time I wake up? You and your precious, useless books can find a new place to live, under a bridge. Perhaps that is where people like you belong." The line went dead with a sharp, final click. Ada squeezed her eyes shut, a familiar burning sensation behind them. She would not cry. Not here. Not now. Crying was a luxury, an indulgence she had learned to suppress. She had already spent her quota for the month. crying silently into her pillow the night she realized she didn't have enough money for both her JAMB registration and a new pair of school shoes. The books had won. They always had to. She took a deep, shaky breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs, and looked up. Her gaze was drawn, as it always was, across the rain-swept, chaotic street to the one place that represented everything she was fighting for. The University of Lagos. Its grand gates and towering faculty buildings were just faint, hazy silhouettes in the downpour, shimmering like a mirage. But to Ada, it was a beacon, a promised land, a world of lecture halls, libraries, and possibilities. A world where what was in your head mattered more than what was in your pocket. She had aced her JAM exams, scoring in the high 290s, a result that had made her tutorial teacher weep with pride. She had poured every spare moment, every ounce of her being, into studying, memorizing formulas by candlelight, trading her meager lunch for extra lessons, reading until the words blurred and danced before her tired eyes. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she was smart enough. She just wasn't rich enough. Her application for a scholarship, her only fragile hope, was still pending, and every day of waiting felt like a lifetime. She pulled her thin, second-hand cardigan tighter around her shivering frame. The wind had picked up, a mischievous accomplice to the rain, whipping the downpour sideways and rendering the small protection of the awning almost useless.